The 17th century, Russian society and the state faced many challenges and responded in a variety of ways. The biggest challenge that the Russian state and society faced was how to pick up the pieces after the collapse of medieval Russia during what is known as the Time of Troubles. The Time of Troubles was a very big and complicated mess, in part because politically, economically, socially, Russia had collapsed and been invaded. And the Rurik dynasty, which had been seen as sort of the political, legitimate rule of Russia during the medieval period, had collapsed, and there was a big question mark of what would come after this. So the big challenge was recovery, and what would recovery look like? What would political recovery look like? Economic recovery? And social recovery, how to sort of refix society after this collapse. Political recovery possibly was the easiest challenge to address. The Zemsky Sobor, the Assembly of the Land, and the Boyar Duma met and chose Mikhail Romanov as the new czar. Mikhail Romanov was young, he seemed like a safe choice, and so the political institution of autocracy was again chosen by Russia as the way to go forward after the Time of Troubles. Mikhail Romanov's father, the Patriarch Filaret, co-ruled with his son and also shared the title of Great Sovereign. Following the first rule of the Romanov, Mikhail Romanov, the Tsar Alexis took over, and some big events happened during Tsar Alexis's reign. Domestic policies at this time were marked by centralization, obedience, and conformity. The state needed revenue, needed to control the population, and resources. We will see these as continuing characteristics of Romanov rule. There were numerous rebellions that reflect resistance to the government demands of more and more taxes. The rebellion of 1648 was one such notable rebellion where the Muscovite population rose up in great anger when taxes on salt and tobacco, seen as necessities of life, were quadrupled. Economic recovery during this time meant expansion. It's considered that the reasons behind expansion were overwhelmingly economic. And Russia sure expanded. Each year of the 17th century, Russia added, on average, a territory the size of modern Portugal. By 1700, Russia was almost 3 times the size of Russia of 1600. Refer to the maps under your Maps button to see this enormous eastward expansion. So, eastward, ho, Siberia. Between 1610 and 1640, Russia advanced 3,000 miles from the Ob River. Control of Siberia transformed Russia into a powerful state in Europe and Asia. Now it's up to the Romanovs to realize how to use all these many rich resources of the East. The Stroganov family gained a monopoly to develop these resources, such as iron, salt, lumber, and fur, and was able to help out the new Romanovs to beef up the treasury after it had been drained in the Time of Troubles. So there was a close connection between the wealthy families using these resources in the East and helping out the state, the crown, to recover. An eastward empire was being created. By the end of 16th century, garrison towns had been established, and these garrison towns become a feature of Russian expansion. The native populations had been pacified by the use of force. The Cossacks particularly were quite adept at using this, and taxes and tribute were being demanded. Peter I will continue this eastern colonization and will continue much of these policies. Russia also moves westward and gains Ukraine, which was also a very valuable area in terms of its resources and its population. Previously, since 1569, Ukraine had been under Polish and Lithuania rule. The Cossacks had turned to the Russian state and had hoped by getting Russian backing that the Cossacks then would ultimately be able to carve out an independent Ukraine that was Cossack ruled. They were badly mistaken about this, but in 1654, Russia engineers a union of Ukraine and then builds on the absorption of Ukraine with the Treaty of Andrussovo of 1667, which establishes the Dnieper River as the boundary. Please again see the maps for more detail on this. This is a really important phenomenon for Russian history because as Russia absorbs Western land, it gains great control of resources and of the population, but also is able to gain a warm water port, which is very important. The control of the Black Sea area is a great desire and ultimately will be accomplished down the road. Now, what to do about society that had just become unfixed during the time of troubles? The state needs a society that is in place to be able to collect taxes, to be able to demand services. With this in mind, then, in 1649, serfdom becomes a legal, permanent, hereditary institution, and this law code of 1649, which institutionalizes serfdom or fixes the population in place, helps to solidify the service state and the nobles' control over the peasants. We'll see this as a central feature of the Romanov Russian world. Another important event that happens during the reign of Tsar Alexis is the Raskol, or the Church Schism. The patriarch Nikon was also ruling as a co-ruler with Tsar Alexis, even though Tsar Alexis did not really like it. Nikon had attempted to engage in church reforms that essentially meant bringing the Russian Orthodox Church in line with the Greek Orthodox Church. He also desired to place the state under the church, creating a theocracy. Nikon was a very arrogant man and ultimately was defrocked by a church council and banished. So the Tsar didn't like the notion of a theocracy, but he was willing to endorse the reforms. These reforms were seen as an attack upon the traditions or rituals of the Russian Orthodox Church, and many of the faithful Orthodox believers refused to accept these reforms, and an uproar ensues over these reforms. Now, again, most of these reforms were not about sort of theology, but they were about the practices of how many hallelujahs to say or how many fingers to use to make the sign of the cross, as this image shows that for the old believers that the sign of the cross was using 2 fingers rather than 3, and this becomes sort of a symbol of the old believers as they are persecuted, they are sent into exile, they are killed, burned at the stake. The old believers are an example of this gap between the state, who is beginning to embrace Western ideas of reforming society, and the resistance of reform by elements of Russian society. That the state breaks with the conservative outlook of Russian society and begins to engage in a more sort of Western approach, as we'll see as again a characteristic of Peter the Great. The Archpriest Avvakum is possibly one of the most noted old believers, and his account of his sufferings as an old believer is a classic and well worth reading if you get the opportunity to read his memoirs, not only about his persecution, but also his experiences in the vast Siberian wilderness. Another important event during the reign of Tsar Alexis is the Stanka-Razin revolt of 1670-71. The ingredients for mass upheaval were in place. Bondage, restrictive state powers, spiritual crisis, fiscal crisis. All you need is a charismatic leader, such as Stanka Razin, and you've got yourself a rebellion. And so this rebellion spreads. Stanka Razin is sort of like a Robin Hood of his age. He becomes a very popular symbol of freedom, peasants who are unhappy with the demands of the state are running away to the periphery and joining up with the Cossacks and really connect with his message of returning to the golden age of freedom, which of course is a big question mark of when that golden age of freedom really was. Not surprisingly, this resistance was crushed. Serfdom is reinforced. Ultimately, the rebellion is no match for Tsar's troops, and Razin is no match for the Tsar's troops either. He meets a very grim end. He's tortured and quartered, his arms and legs and heads placed on stakes, his rest of his body is thrown to the dogs. Well, in sum then, the first Romanovs, they have expanded the Tsarist absolutist authority. In pretty quick time, they have been able to increase state demands of more taxes, more resources, more service. The nobles have benefited from the institutionalization of serfdom. And you see then the growth of the state, the growth of bureaucracy, of taxes, of the military, and the control of the population has been tightened with the 1649 law code institutionalizing serfdom. There are no real legal checks on the government power at this point. These are going to be important characteristics established in the early years of Romanov rule that we will see Peter the Great build on.